book of Genesis, chapter 22. Very familiar chapter. Should be. Preach many messages from this chapter. We'll read verses 7 and 8. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. Again, this, of course, is a part of the account of Abraham offering up his son, Isaac. At this point in the account, it's been 3 days since God told Abraham in verse 2, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering. Nowhere else. There. Upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. And we read at the close of verse 3 that Abraham went into the place, that is, headed toward Moriah, which God told him. Abraham, Isaac, 2 young men with them head north toward the land of Moriah. In verse 4, they arrive in the land of Moriah. And obviously at this point, God revealed to Abraham the precise mountain that he would have him and Isaac go to. Verse 5, And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you. So they arrive at the place, and Abraham says to his 2 servants, You watch the mule, while I and Isaac go and worship, and we'll be back. In verse 6, Abraham is seen taking the wood, putting it upon the back of his son. He also took the means of starting fire. He took his knife, and they went both of them together. So Abraham and Isaac are headed up that mountain. Quite a scene. Isaac, with the wood upon his back. Abraham, with the means of a fire and a knife. We come to verse 7, and Isaac speaks to his father, asking him a question. Where's the lamb? Remember, we're going to worship. Where's the lamb for a burnt offering? In verse 8, Abraham says clearly and very confidently, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. That's the whole point of the Old Testament. The whole record of the Old Testament is God will provide himself a lamb. God will. God will. It was an expression of faith. It was an expression of assurance and conviction. God will. And those 2 words explain the why and the how of everything that Abraham has done up to this point and during those 3 days. They're also an explanation of what he would yet do. So what is recorded in this chapter is made mention of in Hebrews 11:17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. So this is an account. It is a powerful example of faith. It is an example of a willingness to let go of Isaac, thy son, thine own son, whom thou lovest. It's an example of his willingness to let go, trusting God. So, I want to speak on the subject of the power of God's will, or the power of God will. Notice in the text, it is God will, and we've preached on this before, and then the latter part of verse 8. So in the first part you have God will, and then so they went. Abraham says God will. He has confidence in the faithfulness of God. So they. They're acting upon God will. God will. It was a compelling force. It's the compelling force of the account. God will. It serves as an explanation of the entire account. How could Abraham do this? Because of his confidence, his assurance in God will. God will provide himself a lamb. It's what marks the whole account. God will. I believe it's the point of the entire account. God will. So it's an account of personal willingness, surrender, obedience to God, perseverance in the will of God, and it all has its basis in those two words. God will. God will. I don't know how He will, Isaac, and I don't even know when He will, but God will. And everything comes back to that. So let's look at the event recorded in the chapter. The chapter begins with, and it came to pass after these things, which is a statement of God's providence, which is a statement of His faithfulness. It is a statement of God's precise order. After these things, it came to pass. There's an order. It is a statement of God's all-wise timing. And all of this is important leading into the subject of the chapter. In this case, I believe it not only refers back to, after these things, Genesis 21:34. It most definitely refers back to that. And Abraham sojourned in the Philistines' land many days. After these things, it came to pass. But in a larger aspect, it refers back to Abraham's whole life up to this point. Back in chapter 12, Abraham, at the age of 75 years old, is called to leave his homeland and go to a land that he knows not of. Abraham leave your home. I'll tell you where you're going later. And we hear God say to Abraham there in Genesis 12:1, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house. Get away from them unto a land which I will show you. So you don't even have to know where you're going to leave. Just trust God. We see it was a call to separation from his country, from his relatives, from his father's house. It was a call from the natural ties of man. Connected with that was a promise of what God would do. He says, I will show thee. I will make of thee. And I will bless. 3 times, I will. We see the response of Abraham in Genesis 12:4. And Abraham departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him. So he leaves his homeland based upon God will. Based upon God saying, I will. He leaves his homeland. Genesis 15:1, God again appears to Abraham, revealing to Abraham, Abraham, I'm everything you need. We need to know that. He says, fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. Reading on in chapter 15, God again promises him a seed or a son. The years pass. Abraham and Sarah still have no children. Chapter 17, God promised Abraham, he's now 99 years old. 24 years after he left his home. The next year, he and Sarah would have a son. And they were to name him Isaac. In Genesis 21, verses 2 and 3, we read of the birth of Isaac. After 25 years of waiting, God fulfills his promise. 25 years. Most of God's people aren't willing to wait 5 minutes. 25 years to the fulfillment of, I will. And Abraham kept pressing on. Leading into chapter 22. God has heard, or Abraham has heard God say numerous times, under a wide variety of circumstances, I will. I will. You go into chapter 17, you see it in verse 2, verse 6, verse 7, verse 8, verse 16, verse 19. You see it through chapter 12. I will. I will. So Abraham is familiar with those words from God. I will. And in each case, in the process of time, God's time, God did what he said he would do. Every time. Abraham witnessed that. Abraham experienced that over and over. So Abraham, through a variety of experiences in his life, is being taught that God is a God of his word. That's what he's being taught. That's a lesson that many need to learn. God is a God of His Word. He's being taught the faithfulness of God. Coming to chapter 22, and it came to pass after these things. Abraham has experienced the faithfulness of God over and over. God did tempt or test Abraham. What God is doing is preparing Abraham. He has been preparing Abraham for this hour. He's really not testing Abraham to find out who Abraham is. But He's giving this test to Abraham so that Abraham will know more fully who God is. And that's been so from chapter 12 on. Abraham has been learning who God is. A lesson that all need to learn. In verse 1, God calls him by name. Abraham knew that voice. Abraham knew God. He had personally experienced God in his life. He had come to the realization that he belonged to God. He loves God. God loves him. He's come to the realization that God always had done what was best for Abraham. And that God was faithful. And that God was able. He's learned all these lessons. So he responds to God saying, Abraham, Abraham. He responds, here am I. Here am I. In verse 2, we then read of God's command to Abram. Take now thy son. He didn't say, take Isaac. That's not what he said. That's what he meant. But the emphasis, take now thy son. Thine only son. And then he mentions his name. Didn't have to tell him his name. Abraham knew his only son. But again, it's all for emphasis. Thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest. And get thee into the land of Moriah. And offer him, who? Thine only son, Isaac. Offer him for a burnt offering. Abraham knew what a burnt offering was. Upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. That was a staggering demand from God. That was a startling demand from God. Abraham would have never, ever expected such a command. Abraham knew that it was God, when all hope was gone, who miraculously and graciously and lovingly gave him and Sarah Isaac. And he knew that Isaac was God's promise for his future. And that all the promises to Abraham were linked to Isaac. And now that same God is commanding Abraham, kill your son. Offer him for a burnt offering. But Abraham believed what he expressed in verse 8. God will provide himself a lamb. So we read those words, "Take now thy son, thine only son, whom thou lovest, and offer him a burnt offering." This was something that would go against every fiber of Abraham's being. It makes no sense. It would go against all his natural affections. It would go against all the natural inclinations of Abraham. It's contrary to the reasoning of Abraham or anyone else as far as that's concerned. But Abraham believed what he would later express there in verse 8. God will. God will. In verse 3, we read of Abraham's response to the unexpected turn of events and this demand. And Abraham rose up early in the morning. He rose up early that morning believing what he would later express in verse 8. God will. God will. And we're told that he prepared his mule for the journey. He cut the wood that would be necessary for the burnt offering. He gathered 2 of his servants and Isaac, all the while believing God will provide himself a lamb. There's no record of hesitation. There's no record of arguing with God. There's no record of him questioning God. There's no record of him murmuring against God. There's no record that Abraham in any way tried to avoid or escape what God was calling him to do. Abraham didn't know why. He didn't know precisely where God was taking him or what God was doing. But he knew and had personally experienced the person where the instruction had come. And he believed. He believed what he would later express again in verse 8. He knew God doesn't make any mistakes. He knew the promise of God. He knew that there was no circumstance where God would break His promise. And he knew that God was able. And again, he knew that God loved him. And he knew that God had his best interest in mind. And knowing all of that, Abraham that morning stepped out with God. He stepped out with God. And we read, and went unto the place of which God told him. So there they are. Headed for the land of Moriah. And you and I can only imagine how Abraham's mind must have raced with thoughts. And I believe with each thought, there was this: God will. God will. And he pressed on. During that 3-day journey, imagine where his mind went every time he glanced at Isaac. But with each glance, there was this: God will. God will. And he pressed on. During that 3 days, I imagine that he thought of Sarah. But there was this: God will. God will. And he pressed done. During that 3 days, I'm pretty certain there were temptations. I'm pretty certain that Satan whispered in his ear. But Abraham kept coming back to this. God will. God will. And he pressed done. In Abraham's heart, God will triumphed over natural affection. It triumphed over human reason. It triumphed over self-will. And he pressed on. You can be sure of this was not an easy 3 days. I imagine the longest 3 days was life. But Abraham made that journey. Believing and knowing God will. After 3 days, God obviously said to Abraham, this is the place. And Abraham says to his 2 servants there in verse 5, abide ye here, and I and the lad will go yonder. You abide here, we're going yonder and worship. This whole chapter is a wonderful example of worship. Never mind. And notice, and come again to you. Abraham believed God will provide himself a lamb. But if he did not, Hebrews 11:19, he believed that God would resurrect Isaac. Either way, we're coming back. We're coming back. You wait here. He is persuaded. God will. Up to this point, again, Hebrews 11:19, Abraham believes that if God doesn't provide himself a sacrifice, that he will raise Isaac. Up to this point, there's no record of God raising the dead to life. But Abraham believed that God could do what was unheard of. The degree of Abraham's faith is that he was willing to let go of Isaac. That's a good way to measure faith. What are we willing to let go of? Thine only son. Verse 6, Abraham and Isaac are headed up that mountain, getting closer to the appointed place. I imagine Abraham's looked around to see if there's a lamb anywhere. So far, no sign of anything. No sign of provision in sight. But Abraham's still clinging to God will. And as they make their way up that mountain, verse 7, Isaac says, my father. And again, that had to have an effect. Those 2 simple words had to have an effect upon the heart of Abraham. My father. And then he comes this question. Again, Isaac's a young man at this time. And he says, where's the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham's response was what he believed. God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. And that's when we read, so they went both of them together. They went believing God will. Now both of them are embracing the faithfulness and the ability and the love of God. So, they went together. I believe they're energized by God will. God will, that energized them. We read in verse 9, and they, Abraham and Isaac, came to the place which God had told him of. Still no sight of God's provision. No sign of God's provision. Nothing. Nothing. And we read, and Abraham built an altar there. And again, imagine the thoughts that go through his mind as he's building that altar. But there's this one overriding thought. God will provide Himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So he continued. And it says he laid the wood in order. And again, you can only imagine the thoughts that are going through Abraham's mind. But there's this overriding thought. God will. God will. Then we read, he bound his son Isaac. Isaac was willing to be bound. That speaks volumes. Abraham was willing to bind his son. Notice that it does not merely say, and bound Isaac, but it is bound Isaac, his son. Again, emphasis. Bound Isaac, his son. Those are not unnecessary words. Well, we'll change that and we'll just make it say bound Isaac. But you've missed it. There's emphasis. You read those words again and again. Isaac, his son. Isaac, his son. He bound his son. And as he was doing so, I'm sure that he was looking for evidence. Any kind of sign of God's provision. But nothing. Nothing. And as he bound his son, he continued to believe. He was persuaded. God will provide Himself a lamb for a burnt offering. And then it says, and laid him, Isaac, on the altar upon the wood. Again, think of the emotion of both Abraham and Isaac. And I'm sure that there were inward struggles going on. But there's this overriding thought. God will. That's faith. Faith is not without struggles. It's not without struggles of mind. We're human beings. There's going to be struggles of mind. But faith overrides those struggles. Knowing God will. God will. Most of God's people would have stopped long before this point. Well, there's nothing, this is obvious. I've misread this whole situation. But Abraham just held on to God will. Provide Himself. And then we read, again, He laid Isaac on the altar upon the wood. There's Abraham. He's letting go of Isaac. He's letting go of Isaac. But he's holding on to God will provide Himself with a lamb. Let go. It's not always easy to let go. And God will tell us to let go of things that are dear to us. How do you do that? How do you let go? You hold on to God. You hold on to Him. You can't let go if you don't hold on to God. And that's what Abraham is doing. He's holding on to God will. God will. Verse 10, there's Abraham with knife in hand. But what has gripped the heart of Abraham is God will provide Himself a lamb for a burnt offering. In verse 11, the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham! Abraham! He said, Here am I. Here am I. And then there's this instruction. Lay not thine hand upon the lad. Neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. You read the end result, verse 13 and 14. God made God's provision. And all the joy. When Abraham looked up and saw that ram caught in a thicket, all the joy that flooded his soul. And if you follow faith, you just keep on. Regardless. You keep on, you just hold on to God. All the joy that you will eventually come to. God's people stop way too short most of the time. And all the praise that filled his heart. You think about it. Had Abraham stopped in any portion of this trip leading up to where we are now, his heart wouldn't have been filled with praise, or joy, or thanksgiving. But he just kept on, progressing, believing. So again, make some personal application, and we'll close. Just as it was with Abraham, at any time, at any place, there can occur the unexpected, what you never thought you would have to experience. That can happen at any time. At any time, the inconceivable can happen. At any time, the incomprehensible. There can be an incomprehensible turn of events in our lives. At any time or place, that which is beyond human reason can come into our lives. What came into Abraham's life would be labeled by many as an impossible demand upon him. At any time or place, what is seemingly impossible can be placed upon us. But Abraham, that morning, stepped out with God. During that 3-day journey, he was with God, knowing God will. God will. When the difficult and the trying, the unexpected, the inconceivable, the incomprehensible comes into our life, when it came into Abraham's life, he had resolute assurance that God is who he says he is. He had that assurance. That's faith. And he had the assurance, even when there was no evidence, God is able. No evidence of provision, but he still had the assurance that God would provide. He went step by step, moment by moment, believing, knowing, trusting, and practicing. God will. God will. Oh, that be our life. The world, of course, can be a place of uncertainty. It always is, whether we realize it or not. And there can be relentless and burdensome demands placed upon us. And there can be many complications and many obstacles. But we can approach each day step by step, knowing God will. God will. We need to recognize that each day. God will do what he said he would do. God is faithful. We need to recognize that every step of the way. God will. We need to believe that. God will. We need to have confidence in that. God will. Depend upon it. God will. Each and every step of the way. Today it is, well, I believe God will, but just in case he doesn't, I'm doing this. Well, you don't really believe. God will. Embrace it. Embrace that. That's how you're able to let go of Isaac. Embracing God. Lean upon it. God will. Draw from it. Oh, it's a well that we can draw from. God will. Live in the reality of it. God will. Again, God will, so they. Base your life upon it. That's what that's saying. God will. God is faithful. Base your life upon it. Every day. Oh, may those two words so grip our hearts and minds that in every aspect of life we're swayed by it. God will. God will. And it could be, I don't know what God will do, but I know what he will do will be best for me. God will. God will. This is faith. The power of God will. There's great power there. There's great enablement in such faith. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us